Victor Kgomoeswana is the head of marketing for the University of Limpopo and author of Africa is Open for Business. He joins us now live. Mr. Kgomoeswana, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us and a warm welcome to the late edition.
Good evening, Simpiwe. Good to talk to you again.
It's an absolute pleasure having you join us this evening, sir. Now, first of all, we've just seen President Ramaphosa raising concerns about the potential U.S. tariffs on South African goods. He also suggested that, the exporters must diversify their destination markets. But from a business perspective, Mr. Kgomoeswana, how real and imminent is this threat? And what are the sectors most vulnerable if it materializes? And what practical steps can South African businesses take immediately, to sort of reduce over-reliance on traditional markets like the U.S. and the EU?
Okay, the question has two parts, Simpiwe. The danger is real if you're talking about somebody like President Trump.
Yep.
But in the US, there's always the perception that Trump will always chicken out. I forget what they call it. There's an acronym for it. That he will make these threats about imposing tariffs, and after a few days or a few weeks, he will go back and say, we've got a deal. Unfortunately, if you are a 4 billion rand investment over and above the multi-billion investment that you've made, like BMW, you cannot be at the mercy of somebody as erratic as that. Some of these saber-rattling tactics are going to just have to be set out until he's no longer president, because I'm sure they won't materialize. The problem is what the second part of your question, concentration risk, and what the president said.
Yes.
You cannot in business rely on one market or a few markets that depend on you for exports, the way the automotive exports go to Germany, to the UK, but a lot of them go to the US, and that's why they'll be worried about this. What surprises me, Simpiwe, is why the president is only talking about diversifying now, when South Africa is supposed to be a key member of the BRICS alliance, and also the African Continental Free Trade Area is something that's supposed to improve the exports to the African countries. I suppose if you're talking automotive exports, because the German automotive companies have been closing factories while Chinese manufacturers are opening more and more, perhaps there's not much you can do, because you can't sell to China where they are already making cars in South Africa and selling to the market here at a very low price. But for agriculture and other exports, I am sure the BRICS alliance is one area that's going to have to be looked to make sure that we depend less and less on the likes of the United States. I would say BRICS, if you look at India, Russia, China, and just you get 2-3 billion rand, 3 billion people, that will dwarf the American market by far if you are able to open the channels there. The question is the president making speeches about this? Is he doing anything concrete to follow this trade policy diversification that he's talking about? And that's what always worries me. I hear him talking, but I don't hear him saying, in the view of the threat from the United States, because it's not a new threat. Yeah. We have already done the following things to ensure that we can export to our BRICS partners, especially because we talk a lot about being a critical member.
Mr. Kgomoeswana, you made a very pointed statement earlier on that for businesses to thrive and be sustainable, they shouldn't focus on one single market. And having said that, have South African exporters then been too slow to sort of pivot towards African and Asian markets, despite policy encouragement under initiatives such as the AfTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Yeah, South African businesses, if I may generalize, and I don't think it's fair, I'm not sure it's fair to the likes of ShopRite and companies like Standard Bank that have done business on the African continent for a very long time. But generally, South Africa Inc. has not made the rest of Africa a priority market. The other reality, though, is that the African region also has not prioritized making the movement of goods and people across borders a priority. Only now, with the promulgation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, are we seeing the move towards that. So I think it's not about being slow. It's about the traditions, just old habits dying hard. But we need to be a lot more intentional. Remember, Companies like BMW are not manufacturing in South Africa without incentives from the South African government. It used to be called the Motor Industry Development Plan, which gave them a lot of incentives for manufacturing their cars in South Africa. So if we are going to talk about exporting to elsewhere on the continent, I suppose in the same way that we gave incentives to car manufacturers to manufacture for exports to the United States and European markets, we're going to have to devise incentives that will make exporting to Africa, the rest of Africa, and China and Brazil and India as attractive as it has been to export to the US and the European markets.
And just going through and listening to some of these sentiments that have been elucidated at that particular event in Pretoria and Roslyn, I mean, BMW emphasized technology transfer as part of its continued investment here in South Africa. Just how critical is technology transfer for South Africa to remain competitive in manufacturing globally, especially as automotive markets shift towards electric vehicles? And Mr. Kgomoeswana, I don't want to digress and talk about whether much groundwork has been laid in South Africa in terms of adapting to technological investment. And we certainly cannot talk about technology transfer without touching on policy or infrastructural bottlenecks that still exist that could possibly limit the positive impact of such technology transfers in South Africa, in South Africa's automotive and broader manufacturing sectors.
Yeah, no disrespect to BMW. I mean, that was good PR they did there, getting the president to speak at their factory. But they know they are not doing half as much as they could do to bring some of the manufacturing. The value chain of these cars, Simpiwe, is still in Europe. The bulk of the technology, the real components that make cars as expensive as they are still being made in Europe and in other countries. We are assembling cars here. They mustn't create the impression that we are now suddenly part of the bigger value chain. They know we are not. In fact, what I don't like is how the president again is talking about we must still beneficiate. I mean, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka was the Minister of Mineral Resources back then, and she was talking about beneficiation. This is more than 20 years ago. I'm not impressed that we are still just talking about beneficiation at this juncture when we are obviously being targeted as the whipping boys when President Trump wants to flex his muscles and prove that he's still as powerful as an American president. I'm not impressed that we are not talking about beneficiation. We are not creating incentives for the automotive industry to manufacture more of its components on the African continent or in South Africa. We are not investing enough in the education that's required to be able to do that.
Okay, fair point you're making there, Mr. Kgomoeswana, but I'm quite keen to know whether diversification will dilute the competitiveness of South African exporters if they spread their markets too thin, or does it perhaps strengthen their resilience in global trade?
Diversification is always a good hedging strategy. If you depend too much on one market and that market is predictable and it's reliable, then there is no problem. But as you can see, the US has been doing business with South Africa for a very long time. And all of a sudden, President Trump comes to the scene and he causes all the rumblings. He's just kicking dust everywhere. So that's where diversification is a better strategy. In fact, if you want to understand the importance of diversification, go and speak to fund managers and investment strategists. They will tell you you must never put your eggs in one basket.
All right, Mr. Kgomoeswana, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time. And I mean, the president spoke under the theme Leading Today, Enabling Tomorrow. And the jury's still out whether South African policymakers and business leaders practically embed this principle into industrial policy to drive long-term growth, I would say. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.